from a purely corporate financial structure, every month was very painful because you had all these different people coming from different systems with different language and different charts of accounts and trying to marry all this together. It got to be really difficult. And it became extremely difficult to figure out what's going on with our business. And it was hard to measure because everyone thought about things differently. So the global was really just saying, let's have one system, one database that everyone's in.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the WBS Podcast. I'm Sam Gupta, your host and principal consultant at digital transformation consulting firm Elevate IQ. The larger the organization, the harder it becomes to roll out the ERP implementation and truly reap its benefits. Also, the ERP implementation needs to be treated as a continuous improvement project as the context will change over time. And as you acquire more data from your ERP implementation, you will have more opportunities to improve your processes. If you don't share your inventory, customer, and vendor data across sites, you will not gain true cost-saving opportunities due to the siloed nature of your organization. Also, you need to analyze if there might be standardization opportunities available by utilizing similar equipment or processes. In today's episode, our guest, Bob Feathers, shares his insights and lessons learned from a multi-site ERP implementation. He also discusses their rationale for data sharing across sites, including customers, vendors, and items, and walks us through their selection and implementation process. Finally, he discusses the challenges they ran into in the post-implementation phase due to the lack of testing and commitment from users and why ERP implementations need to be treated as a continuous improvement projects even after the implementation. Let me introduce Bob to you. Bob Feathers has spent 30 plus years in manufacturing with hands-on experience in operations, management, finance, project management, and client services. He specializes in business system implementation, including 4 single-site and 1 multi-site implementation. He is currently a project manager of tech initiatives for Bindable, a leader in the InsurTech space, offering a full stack of technology-enabled services. With that, let's get to the conversation. Hey Bob, welcome to the show. I am super excited to have you today.
Great. I'm super excited to be here. It's been a long time coming for you and I to have some one-on-one time.
Of course. Just to kick things off, do you want to start with your personal story and your current focus, Bob?
Sure, absolutely. My current focus, I work for a company called Bindable. We're in the InsurTech space, and we're a full-stack technology enabling our clients to do alternate distribution of insurance. And I focus on client implementations and also internal projects to make our platform better. But my prior life, and kind of why you and I are here together, is I spent over 30 years in the manufacturing space and worked in many roles across that time frame: client services, operations management, production control, finance for many, many years.
Yep.
And then kind of took all those pieces together and worked on the business system implementation and project management, doing ERP implementations over a course of years for my company, along with a global financial one and a global ERP for 7 sites in 4 countries.
That's amazing. So I am going to be super interested in digging into the entire story and the entire journey of how the implementation went. Obviously, there are going to be tons of learning, but before we do that, we have one of these standard questions for all of our guests, and that is going to be, Bob, your perspective on business growth.
Yeah, when I think about growth, I always like to do the word sustained. Okay. Right? Because I think a lot of times talk about sustaining growth. But so with that, I kind of look at it as being consistent exploration and curiosity. right? Never being satisfied. You're always looking to grow in kind of that continuous improvement model. That's kind of how I look at it. It seems simplistic, but again, a lot of times the sustaining part's the really hard part, right? People do continuous improvement. They'll do certain incremental changes, but then they don't sustain it. So I think the sustaining is really hard for people to do, and keeping those commitments to really keep the train moving, never be static.
I absolutely agree. Thank you so much for that perspective. I absolutely love it. So now let's dig into the implementation, right, that you had. So how I want to start this is if you could describe the business when you started with this, how the business was, maybe talk about business model, talk about different products, how many different entities, what was the role of the entities, how was the organizational structure laid out. So do you want to provide some background of the business?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So the business was a privately owned business.
Okay.
And we had plants around North America. We had plants in Europe. We've had plants in South America over the years. And we had plants in Australasia. Over the years, the company was acquiring and selling off units.
Okay.
So it was really dealt with as more of kind of real estate holdings, right? As the company wanted to grow, it said, hey, let's acquire something somewhere else. It's kind of more about that site.
Yeah.
It was never brought into the whole organization. It was just, they were all siloed sites. So it's just a way for the corporation to kind of gain value to themselves. But then they'd sell off sites when things weren't working, or if it just felt like a good opportunity, or it didn't seem to fall in with what they felt was the corporate structure. So over time and some changes in our CEO, we kind of got to the point where in North America, we had 4 facilities that were really working more closely together. So our Boston facility in Toronto, we're doing the same product mix.
Yeah.
We were in the card printing business, secure technology, and they're mostly doing the same product mix.
Yeah.
The business in Dallas was a software business, software hardware.
Yeah.
But the solutions they were selling were in the financial space. That the Boston office supplied the products. Some of the card product and it fell within the financial space. So it's kind of a natural fit. And then the Tennessee was into distribution. It was kind of an actual model, one of the original acquisitions. But the distribution fell into some of the things that Boston wasn't really good at. We could send things down to the Tennessee plant. So there started to be some kind of movement in terms of sharing business or moving business where we saw fit. What was happening, though, is we had 4 separate ERP systems, all the same software, but different databases.
Interesting.
And then above that, we had a global financial package which tied the 4 together.
Yeah.
But there was no real synergy between those databases, meaning if you had to run cost in each one separately, and you had to have people kind of dealing with each database separately. So what was happening was we were so many versions behind, which happens, right? You're not paying attention and you're not doing the work.
Yeah.
And we kind of said, we're at an inflection point. We've got to do something. And we also said, our business has changed so much over the course of the time. The original system was built as a single entity.
Yeah.
And now we were 4 entities, essentially. Yeah. So we said, it's time, right? It's time to make a change. So we went to leadership. I went with a full proposal to redo North America.
Yeah.
And the CEO said to me, well, why wouldn't we do the whole globe? And I went, oh, I wasn't thinking about Australasia.
Yeah.
But we certainly can bring that into the fold.
Yeah.
However, I need to kind of take a step back, take my plan for North America, put it aside, and kind of rethink the whole scope. The good news was the plants in Australasia, the one in Sydney was very much like our plant in Boston. It had the same kind of product mix, had a service bureau. So it's kind of like, oh, that's interesting. Same products, we can kind of deal with that. The plant in New Zealand was certainly just a service bureau.
Yeah.
So now we had Boston, Sydney, and New Zealand with all service bureaus. We had, again, this kind of a same product mix or same style of what was going on. And in Melbourne, it was distribution. They did more distribution and personalization, kind of bureau and distribution.
Yeah.
So again, they had a little bit of the Tennessee and a little bit of the bureau. So in some ways, they're kind of a natural fit to say, hey, let's look at all these together and kind of think about this globally and think about how we're going to approach this ERP. And the simple answer was North America had the one software system.
Yeah.
And Australasia had 2, but they were really tied to one.
Yeah.
And it really just became one of those, which one are we going to choose because we are tied to these 2? And which region's going to be unhappy that they're going to lose their system and they're going to gain the other one. We looked at 2 other systems just to be clear, just to be complete with our analysis. But it just made sense from a cost standpoint to stick with one or the other because we're kind of tied to the learning and tied to the integrators that we worked with.
Okay, amazing. So very interesting background. So now obviously we can go in many different directions. And one of the important directions here is going to be, I don't know if you're going to have the rationale behind these acquisitions. I don't know how the acquisitions were performed. I don't know if they were trying to capitalize into any specific product categories or any specific market. That could have been the rationale. But then you end up with all of these systems in global portfolio. You have sort of the global financial system that is doing the math, but actually you don't have the synergy. So when you are going to create, let's say, the as versus to be, obviously you need to know what was the background before you can sort of paint, okay, where the global synergy is going to be. So when your boss said that, you know what, let's do global, there must be some thought process in that. So do you want to touch a little bit on the acquisition background and also the thought process in terms of where the synergies are going to be in the global architecture?
Sure. Acquisitions I can't speak to directly, other than as they were kind of getting rid of some businesses, shedding some certain businesses, and kind of going into Australasia to kind of grow our portfolio. They were looking for certain like businesses, meaning we're kind of looking for things in the car production. So we weren't going off the reservation and going, hey, let's go get a sheet metal plant, right? So we certainly weren't going that direction. So we're kind of staying within a certain scope of it. But from the system standpoint, it was pretty basic at first. One of the basic principles was just reporting. And you had all these different systems. So from a purely corporate financial structure, every month was very painful because you had all these different people coming from different systems with different language and different charts of accounts and trying to marry all this together. It got to be really difficult. We had somebody in corporate and I don't use corporate as a site, but just, kind of corporate was sitting there and they're compiling this information. And it became extremely difficult to figure out what's going on with our business. And it was hard to measure because everyone thought about things differently. So the global was really just saying, hey, you know what? Let's have one system, one database that everyone's in and kind of build this structure so that at least we can go in there and extract things out and start to get some meaning that, kind of have some more level loading, so to speak, or level set of our information. That was kind of that's the real basic inflection point, was just kind of that I want information out. I want it to be consistent. I want it to be aligned. I want it to make sense. I want to get it quickly.
Okay, so that's a very interesting point there. So I definitely want some more colors there. Maybe, I don't know if you're going to have any specific examples. So I'll tell you my perspective. So let's say if I have my 4 entities and I have, I don't know, maybe 600 chart of accounts on this one, 500 on this one, 400 on this one. Maybe they are not really using the common language, but it's not as complex because you have, let's say if you are doing just the sum of these chart of accounts, then this is going to be 600 plus 400 plus some here. So overall, from the reporting perspective, it's not as complex. But we both know that we have been in the ERP system space for a long time, that could be a lot of work because you have to really understand how the reporting is done. So do you have any specific example why this was taking so much time in your experience in doing the corporate reporting when you have just the few chart of accounts here and just 4 entities?
Yeah, one of the issues was how we looked at the business and how we measured the business.
Okay.
So kind of just like what are the business units?
Okay.
And there was a lot of I'm trying to pull my products out and say how am I measuring this product versus how am I measuring this product?
Okay.
And the reality is that the plants were kind of doing some different measurements in terms of cost of goods, how they were building up their cost of goods, how they're bringing materials into the BOM or not bringing the material into the BOM, or it could be, we call it, it's kind of that, you call it potato, I call it potato, but a lot of times it was very hard for people to speak the same language. So even though, it seems like really easy to bring those things together, it wasn't always simple. And again, not everyone was doing accounting the same way in terms of that cost of goods structure and BOM structure. So it really was a moment where it was hard to kind of get apples to apples, and a lot of apples versus oranges. So it's hard to know what we were doing or how to really measure what was successful. And of course, the other piece, to kind of go into is as the businesses were starting to align more in terms of what we were doing, you start to also look at the global strategy. Are there things we can do to leverage that, right? So we also found that, hey, look, we're buying certain products. Different plants are buying from the same vendor.
Yeah.
And so we're starting to think to ourselves, well, you know what, there's some opportunities for us to leverage that, leverage contracts, and start to, again, think a little broader. The other piece that was starting to happen was sharing equipment. So again, saying, we don't need this equipment more. Rather than buying new equipment, let's ship that equipment to them. There's this kind of transfer of equipment. Then there starts to be transfer of knowledge. And little by little, as we started to build towards this, we started to do some, I would say, buying the same equipment, right? If we're going to go get this here, let's get that same thing over here in Sydney. All of a sudden now we're all kind of, even from a platform standpoint, we can transfer files and say, we can't do it here, go print it there. And so start to build some redundancies. So there's a lot of kind of natural things that started to happen as we started to make this change. We started to think about all the other things that could happen there.
That's very interesting. So let me give you an example, from my experience of different manufacturers that I come across. So one of the things that you mentioned is related to COGS. And obviously the costing needs to be right for you to be able to report at the corporate level. And that's what you were trying to figure out in your company. But if you look at the small to medium-sized manufacturing companies, most of the time they don't even have their costing right, to be honest, if you actually look under the hood, right? So from the corporate reporting perspective, if you really think about it, you are really looking at this big giant bucket that this is my costs. So why do you need to be precise in terms of your costing from your corporate standpoint? Do you have any other colors there that you might be able to provide? Why is that precision important?
So from the standpoint of North America, especially in the Boston and Toronto facility, we were doing actual costing. So we were literally, going in there and doing all the transactions, labor transactions, and people putting their hours in and running through that whole process. In Australasia, they were doing more of a standard costing model where they just basically said, this is what I believe it to be costing, and they would just put it in there. And they were doing lots of adjustments. So they basically had a lot of things going into expenses and then kind of bringing them back into COGS. So it's a little different model. So it was very hard. Again, it wasn't that same kind of like, they weren't doing the transactional piece. They weren't collecting the data, collecting the hours. They just kind of made the assumption, and then we're making adjustments based on, payroll or things like that to how much really was going on. So it was a very different look at things. So it was hard for them to measure what really truly a job. They could say, I know we're making money, but I can't tell you what job's making money. Whereas North America is saying, well, I know exactly what jobs are making money, what clients are making money. And so it's very hard to look at that profitability piece and have a drill down. So Australia just didn't have that drill down, and they wanted it. They said, well, how do I know that's making money? Why, how do I know that's the right sell price and the manufacturing cost if you're not really truly measuring it from a transactional standpoint? So that was the issue in terms of that kind of not, apples and oranges.
Okay, amazing. So obviously this is going to be more from the corporate strategy perspective, the way you need to plan your jobs, the way you need to plan your product, who should be doing what. Obviously that is important. But the translation, did you have any other implications? I don't know if you had an audit firm that was auditing. Did you have any other implications that required this translation? Because I don't know how many manufacturers are really going to be familiar with that they need to do the translation. They can't simply sum it up and report it to the government, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's another, that's one thing you have to definitely be cognizant of is what are the reporting entities, right? What are the legal entities you have to report against? Understanding those. We did, of course, go to a corporate, we had an auditor in North America, an auditor in Australia. We went to a different model where we had then the same auditor across the globe. That was kind of a new change, but that was post-implementation. I mean, I can't speak to the audit so much because I only did a few of them here. I only dealt with the one in Tennessee and Boston. But again, it was an important piece, and kind of going back to why you make changes, right? One of the things we had to really figure out is with these entities, and as I start to think about transferring goods or doing things or transferring things, is I had to think about transactionally what that means in my chart of accounts. So going back to that chart of accounts, right? Is one of the things they wouldn't have had is originally is each place would have had their chart of accounts kind of doing their thing. But now we're saying, well, I may start exchanging goods with you and start shipping goods to you. So I need to have those kind of components in there. How is money, it's like not like I'm paying you, but there is this kind of sense of money is going from one entity to the other entity. And what do those transactions look like? And making sure I build that into my chart of accounts because they didn't exist before, right? They didn't, they're not worried about that in Australia going to North America, but now we have to start thinking about those types of transactions. So another reason why chart of accounts was important in terms of, you're reporting these things, but then how does it really look when your corporate's going, well, exchange rates and moving product from here and there. So that was one of the other key issues to why you want to consolidate your chart of accounts into one.
Yeah, amazing insights there. So let's talk about, some of the other things that you mentioned that is going to be really sharing of the vendors, sharing of the customers, because vendors you need to share because you really want to capitalize on those corporate discounts. You want to have those corporate agreements with the vendors. And if you're not going to have the shared vendors, obviously you are not really capitalizing on those savings. So that's really important. Then your inventory needs to be aligned or be structured in the right manner as well. If one plant is really producing, the other plant is consuming. So your SKU scheme needs to be sort of streamlined overall in terms of who's doing what, and they should be able to talk to each other. So when you started on this journey of data sharing of these different, let's say, if you talk about these SKUs, the customers and vendors, how did you approach this? Which are going to be the common vendors, which are going to be the customers, and which are going to be the common items? How did you structure this?
Yeah, so the structure was, unfortunately, because I'll kind of take one step back.
Yeah.
So one of the pieces we kind of missed, and I won't say we missed it because we wanted to miss it.
Yeah.
It was more we weren't given time to really spend time on it. Was you kind of go from that standpoint of the vision, right? When you talked about the vision, which was we want to have a global ERP system to tie all these plants together, right? Just kind of the high level. And then below that's the real strategy, like, okay, well, what does that look like? And how do I kind of have the transactional? What do I want to do? And kind of look at those pieces. And then you have the tactical piece. We kind of went right to the tactical piece, really didn't think about all the structure, all the strategy pieces.
Yeah.
So we kind of went to a tactical. And because of that, we didn't have time to really address the whole vendor and customer issue. So, and the way it was set up was, so what we ended up doing was we actually put a three alpha character on front of a numeric serialized customer number.
Okay.
And same with a vendor.
Okay.
So we had the system say, vendor number, leading 0, but say vendor number 1, and any plant could just basically hit it, and we had a little custom thing that said, which plant are you? And you put a BOS in front of it. So the idea was the vendor would have a unique number, but it would have this nomenclature front. So you kind of knew who the Boston vendors were, who the Toronto vendors were, and so on and so forth. And the same was true of customers. We just didn't have the time to really address the idea of having one customer for all of them. That being said, we didn't have, when we started to look at the intersection, it's not like we had shared a lot of customers. There was only a small intersection of customers. So overall, it wasn't as if we, because Australasia had their clients. We didn't really share those. There was probably 1 or 2 shared clients, and they really weren't, they were kind of shared, but not really.
Okay.
The North American group was buying from North America, and there's a separate division in Australasia that was buying from them. So they really weren't the same customers, so to speak. And same was true of some of the vendors. So we kind of went into still a siloed approach. So not the best, but over time, post-implementation, we did start to at least address the idea of more corporate contracts, where we kind of went to the vendor and said, hey, the face of the organization said, hey, we're buying this much of this material for these 3 plants. This is what the overall buy looks like. Yeah. You're going to get 3 different POs, but let's kind of work here to get a corporate contract. So we did do a lot of that work there post implementation.
Okay, amazing. So obviously, let's say if you had these vendors consolidated, then you didn't have to put as much admin effort. In this particular case, you were actually tracking 3 different POs, 3 different contracts. Those are going to have 3 different expiry. That is going to probably increase your admin effort in tracking those, in doing the receipts. So a lot of work there overall. Now, let's talk about the inventory. Inventory is where the real problems are. Let's say if your inventory is not really structured the way your manufacturing process is set up or the procurement process is set up, obviously your S&OP planning is not gonna work as per your expectation. I don't know if you sort of did any sort of S&OP or demand forecasting. If you did that, then obviously that is going to see a lot of cracks in that as well, because you don't really have the accurate way of inventory. So did you run into any of those issues? Because I don't know if your inventory was structured the way it was supposed to be structured in the shared model.
Right. So again, same thing to start off with. It really was a siloed approach to inventory.
Okay.
Each plant controlled their own inventory, making their own products, making their own buys, structured there. There was some sharing of products, but again, they kind of came through. So the structure of the system we had was such that, again, we could have a part number.
Okay.
And that resided in the overall database, right? It was a parent, it was a parent part number.
Okay.
And then what happens is you then share that part with multiple sites, either one site or multiple sites.
Okay.
So you'd build this part at the parent level, and you could share it with multiple sites. What was nice at the site level is at the site level, certain things could be changed. You couldn't change the unit measure, right? Unit measure is kind of what it is. But you could change things like the product code, because the product code is really the driver to kind of the financial roadmap to where I want this transaction to go, what I want this part to do. So you could say, for this plant, the part is flagged as being fabricated, and then for this plant, the same part is flagged as being purchased, and so this plant purchases this other one. And you can certainly have some shared kind of transactional pieces where you can have a sales order or a purchase order directly tied to a sales order, and have those things you kind of know when they're going to come, because whatever the schedule is will hit the other system. Because they're separate entities, we had to do it this way. We didn't have there's also that idea of the inter-site, but we didn't have any inter-sites. Each site entity was kind of a one-off. So we didn't have any entities that have multiple sites underneath it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And that's a very interesting comment there. So I am actually going to have a follow-up question there. So when you are sharing this inventory and the only thing you can override is going to be your product code. Now, was that due to the kind of system you were using that it only allowed you to sort of override the product code? Were there any other data elements that you could override, or was this a more of the business decision that, this is how my business is structured, and the only thing I'm going to override is the product code?
No, yeah, so I'll take a step back, right?
Yeah.
It was actually multiple things. It was basically most of it. There was only a few. Unit and measure is really the only things you couldn't change.
Okay.
So you could go into each part. So each site had its own, basically its child part.
Yeah.
You could go in and change your demand fence, your mins and maxes, and your ordering policy. You could even change the vendor, right? Because you're gonna have different vendor. You're gonna have your vendor versus somebody else's vendor.
Yeah.
You could change your purchase unit and measure. So you could certainly do things inside of your piece. It was just the fact that the part was its part number. You couldn't change that, right? It had a structure of part number, and you couldn't change the unit measure. But everything else in it was changeable. You can kind of go in there and make changes to the flags. Was mine fabricated or purchased? Maybe it's both, right? Maybe I purchased it and fabricated. There's different ways to look at it. So certainly there's a lot of flexibility there. Just certain components you couldn't. But again, where it got tricky, then you had your own engineering masters too. So those parts, if it was a fabricated, the engineering masters, they were shared and not shared. So again, because you had separate resources for each site, because those resources did sit at the site level.
Yeah.
But again, you could have a shared, I'll call it nomenclature. You could have a piece of equipment that you called something the same for different plants. We didn't do as good a job as we could have done there.
Yeah.
But we started to go back, and here's what we weren't afraid, going back to my idea of continuous improvement.
Yeah.
Post implementation, we weren't afraid to go, you know what? Now that we're doing this and seeing how these transactions are working and how we're starting to share pieces, we went back and re-implemented part of our data structure for bills of materials for 2 facilities to say, we built this model, it works here, we're going to take this complete model and we're going to put it in Sydney, and we just basically re-implemented Sydney, and then they had the same model we had, and then we took that same model and put New Zealand. So it's another way to do it, right? You say, we're going to build this model, it's not working, let's change it, fix it here, and then go fix it in the other plants once we found success.
Very
But of course, you have lots of old SKUs and lots of old bills of material. But what ERP system does have dead part numbers in it and dead vendors in it? Unfortunately, even one that's a year and a half old. So
yeah. So let's go back to your comment about sharing this whole inventory from the parent level. So did you, let's say, put all of the parts that were there corporate wide, and they were all shared in the parent, and then they were shared with the site, or there were any specific site-specific parts that only resided, let's say, in the site? They were not really shared at the parent level.
I would say for the most part, the majority of the parts were not shared.
Okay.
Right? Because they were not shared, not because it's just because the plants were doing different things.
Okay.
Obviously in the Dallas facility, they're doing hardware, software. So no one's doing what they're doing.
Okay.
So their part numbers were specific to them. Toronto and ourselves, we did a bunch of sharing because we were doing some of the same things. But we didn't share that much with the Australian side because Melbourne was doing paper product and distribution.
Yeah.
Sydney, we started to, right? So Sydney is where we started to make the change after we kind of went, this isn't right. We want to do some more part sharing.
Yeah.
But they also just had different clients, right? They had different customers. So the part numbers were unique because we were making to order, we were make unique parts, right? And kind of not quite engineering order, but like make to order parts. So this is the part I make for this card called Visa, and it's for this client. If I don't have that client, then I can't share that part number. So, for the finished goods side, we didn't have any sharing. And on the raw material side, again, it depended on some of the parts. So we did start to get more there on the, let's say, the chip side. Yeah. Because those are eaches, and it was very easy for us to start to say, hey, we're going to buy this new chip that we're going to put in 3 facilities that are making credit cards, and we're going to have one part, and we're going to share it all. So we started to get better at the model as we learned. We learned from our failures or learn from our transactions and start to get better at it. So, so it was kind of like hindsight 2020. Yeah. If I had a chance to do it over again. But again, it goes back to what I was saying. I wanted to spend more time on strategy. We were really thinking about these things harder. Yeah. We had a pretty good roadmap, but we weren't able to think about all of it. We just had to go tactical, get this system up and running, and then figure it out later. Where the chips fall, hopefully you can pick them up.
Yeah. So let's go back to your journey, and I don't know if you were really involved in the selection process as well. Describe to us how long was the selection process? What was the selection criteria that you chose? What were the major drivers why you chose the system that you chose? And were you happy with the system that you chose afterwards?
Yeah. So I was involved in the process. There was 4 of us. There was 2 of us here in North America. Yeah. The CEO and myself. And there was 2 on the other side, and the other person was similar to myself, right? Kind of a business analyst, implementer. He knew a lot about the system. I would call him more of a solution architect. Yeah. And I think the other player was the CFO. So between the 4 of us, we spent a lot of time talking through it. What are the kind of things we wanted to do? What are the things that were important to us? What were we looking for? And of course, our starting point, right, was we have this software. You guys have this software. So let's start there and kind of walk through what are the pros and cons of the software? What are they doing today? Yeah. What do we see at it? And I will say that my counterpart did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of kind of putting those documents together and really reading through the pieces. And then we took it to the other two other vendors just to kind of get a flavor of what they're doing to see if we're missing anything. Yeah. And then we went to the system integrators to kind of find out what we were talking about cost-wise. And I will say that vendor we had in North America was 1/3 of the cost of the person in Australasia. Really? And the guy in Australasia kind of felt like, you guys aren't big enough for me to care. Like, my starting point is X, and just seemed very dismissive. Yeah. Which in itself didn't feel good, right? Yeah. We're gonna kind of undertake this huge journey. Yeah. And have someone be like, this is the cost. It kind of starts here, and we'll talk to you when you feel like you're serious. Whereas the other vendor was very serious in the conversation and really working with us and, kind of working through that process and what it looks like. And so at the end of the day, it kind of really came down to cost, right? It's a pretty simple formula. When you have 3 or 4 times the cost, you kind of go, I'm not spending that much money to implement. Yeah. Even if this goes to overrun, I'm sure I won't overrun to that level. So sure, it wasn't too hard. It wasn't super scientific at the end of the day. So I kind of answered that already, right? North America was happy because we had the same system we're using. So even though it was the latest and greatest and newest awesome version, there was still a lot of inherent kind of like, I know what it looks like and feels like. So of course, Australasia is kind of gone, we got to learn something completely new. Yeah. And now it's kind of a little bit of that. This is your system, not ours. So there's a little bit of that in the beginning, which you had to kind of get over that piece there, get over the hump of we're all trying to do this together. So yeah.
So from my experience, when I look at similar businesses like you, where you are trying to reverse engineer the process, especially from your existing system that need to be migrated to the new system, sometimes taking out those requirements and could be tricky. And when we look at these ERP systems, let's say if you are going to run into any scenarios where you would require customization of the ERP system, if that was not designed for that specific scenario, it could be very expensive. So if in your case, when you were doing this reverse engineering of the other system that actually was going to be brought into this entity, so what was that process like? How did you sort of map all of the requirements? Did you get all of that down on paper before selecting the system, or did you select the system and then figure out, okay, what are we doing here?
Yeah, it was kind of the system. Like I said, it was like select the system and then go tactical. So really kind of figure out what you're going to do now that you have the system. luckily, again, we had some pretty strong people in terms of really knowing the business process, knowing the products, knowing the plants, knowing how the things were made. There's basically myself and the other person. We intimately knew the plant, knew what they were doing. So that was the good news. The bad news was there was still a lot of siloed kind of thought processes.
Yeah.
There was still, and I'll say, we had some customization here that we kind of had inherent to what we had done.
Yeah.
And Australasia had a lot. And the reason they just had a lot was they were, again, built over time, over acquisitions, where you don't really say to yourself, hey, this is the latest and greatest. This is what this plant's the best. And, it's just every plant was kind of, you just kept buying another one. And no one ever really said, hey, we're going to change the way we do things. So everyone kind of had their components. The other component was they had a lot of developers on their staff.
Okay.
So whenever they came up with a problem, rather than say, hey, let's figure this out in the system, they just said, hey, let's just build a solution for it. And they built another solution. So they had a lot of ancillary solutions that were kind of going on that were feeding into the piece.
Yeah.
So we did really start to say our roadmap was, we're not going to address all of them, but we really need to start to lessen our footprint and figure out how we leverage the system. And we did the same thing in the US. There's only a few minor things that we kind of said, we've got to have this component. It's just something we need that the system just doesn't have. And it's more around data structure, how data gets brought in, because you can't have all the financial data inside your ERP.
Yeah.
There are just some components we had to keep outside. And Australia had the same thing. There were some components that had to stay outside. But again, we are trying to little by little. So it wasn't all at once. It was, again, post-implementation that then we'd say, okay, there's that little segment of business over there. Let's go take care of that ancillary system and let's bring it back into the fold, kind of little by little. So we didn't do it all at once, but we did over time try to get those in. And but again, we're lucky, right? We already had a lot of developers on staff in terms of people that were doing things that could deal with software. So we didn't necessarily need an integrator or the product itself. But again, it's a slippery slope, right? You just go, oh, this doesn't work. So instead of thinking of a different way to do it, you kind of go, well, we'll just keep doing what we're doing and just build something and make it do what we want it to do. So you have to be very careful with that, right? Because the other thing that you have to be very careful about is upgrades. Yeah. So one of the lessons we learned in our old implementation, why we were so out of date, is we just didn't do the updates. We didn't have the staff. We didn't have the stomach to do it, or just no one wanted to do it. We just, every year you just kind of not do it. And next thing you know, 10 years later, you're like, we're in trouble here because we haven't done the updates and we are so far removed from the latest version that they're kind of going, good luck. If your system crashes, we're not helping you. You're like,
right. Yeah.
Luck system's very stable, but still at that point, it's not a good situation to be in. So upgrades, you'd have to be mindful of when you have to do a software upgrade, which they happen. They want to have, fixes and things like that. So if you have a lot of customization, you've got to also do all your own testing to make sure you don't mess anything up when you bring this new upgrade in. So you have to be very mindful of that. That's a very, you have to think about that as you're doing implementation too, is you don't want to do too much customization because then it makes upgrades very difficult or time consuming.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. And I am actually going to talk about the testing since you mentioned that, and especially if you have a lot of custom code here. So my understanding based on this conversation so far is that you had a lot of functionality that you didn't really bring when you actually went live. You went live without actually testing a lot of functionality that may have been as part of the other business. So did you find any sort of surprises that, I'm live now, I'm not able to run my business because I should have tested this before implementation, and now it's going to be much harder because I didn't spend enough time. I just didn't know about my own business that 40% of the business was sitting somewhere that was doing something. I had no idea. I never wrote a test case. I don't know how to test that. And now I'm live. Go figure.
No, everything was perfect, Sam. Everything worked perfectly on day one. No. I'll give you a simple one. And this is a simple one. All during our, demo, I'll call it UAT test. When you got the users in there and you're building the system, you're going in testing. I can't tell you how many times I told people, test your forms. Make sure your forms print. Make sure your forms print. Yeah. Make sure your forms print. Day one goes live. My form's not printing. I can't figure out why I can't print a bill of lading, why I can't do this. Now, I will share with you one of the other components that was going on while we were doing implementation was we as a corporation were completely rebuilding our corporate data structure, our whole data structure of what our system looked like. Yeah. Meaning this database now is a single database. where's the database going to reside? Because it's a database. It's not cloud-based. This is, we have an actual server.
Yeah.
Where's the physical server going to reside? Well, the server is going to reside in Australia, physically in Australia in a server room. Well, now we've got to build this structure that says, oh, we're going to build, we call it, CorpNet, right?
Yeah.
So we had to build this corporate net. And over time, we had to bring everyone's email in, everyone's Outlook in, right? But in the beginning, when we went live, not all that was ironed out. So here's what was happening, right? People going, oh, I can't send this to my email because my email is not inside CorpNet. The system's there. The other was their printers, because their printers were the desktop printers, and they went to printer BL, and it took 45 minutes because it was trying to figure out where this thing was.
Wow.
And so we had to bring all the printers, so we, it was happening in parallel. So, lesson learned was, if you're also going to make a corporate structure to your whole database, your whole structure there, your corporate net, do that first. Make sure that it's all working. So, again, we found out day one, it was like, why is this working? Next thing you know, we're bringing printers and bringing it into the CorpNet. And we had to kind of, reinvent everyone's laptop, everyone's computer had to be brought inside a CorpNet and give it a name and give it, an IP address inside of this CorpNet inside of Australia, so to speak. And then we had to deal with talking back and forth, right? Just that whole connection that, we're talking to, where am I logging on? And so we did the virtual server, right? So we had 16 servers with virtual servers that you kind of logged on to, where the instance of the software was kind of there. So you don't really have the software on your desktop. Because some, you have an instance of on your desktop in a way. We couldn't do that because there's no way you could have 500 users across 7 sites. So you kind of had a virtual desktop. And we had 16 virtual servers where you kind of went in and grabbed your instance and going on. But that was a learning experience. Having those servers. If one of those servers went down, the server farm, all of a sudden people I can't get on. And it didn't take much for this, for your and so the other part was people not logging off, right? Yeah. So we're 24 hours in the way. If you think about where we are, right? We're in North America, and then we go to Australasia. It's like tomorrow, but there's almost a time where everyone's on the system almost 7 days a week. So if people didn't log off, all of a sudden the guy in Sydney comes in the morning. He's like, I can't get an instance to come on because it's concurrent users, right? Yeah. It's concurrent user license. And so we had to put some stuff in there to make sure that, basically kick people off after a certain time, which of course made people mad, right? I think we chose an hour. So, all right, an hour. So you got the one guy that goes on twice a day, and he's like, oh, why do I have to keep logging on all the time? Well, sorry, you log on at 8, do your thing, and if you don't log on again at, until 3 o'clock, you're just going to have to log in again because other people are using the system. Sorry, but and then so anyway, there's a lot of things that go on. So I would say is if you're doing some infrastructure thing, make sure your infrastructure. That's the one thing we didn't do, right? We didn't do enough of our infrastructure piece to really address the issue. So when we went live, there was definitely some hiccups, and then there were some serious hiccups on the inventory side because there were some issues with how we built the bombs. Yeah, and some of those things were not tested correctly. Even though again, it was this was that kind of account, hey, we told you to test it, we gave you to test it, you should have been testing this. I'm not your babysitter. And then you go in live and they're like, where's all my inventory? I'm looking at 10 pieces, but it says I have 0. And it's like, well, you transacted and the system said you used all 10. It's like, well, that's not right. Oh, okay, but
Oh boy, this story is so fascinating that we can probably go on for hours, but we are close to our time now. Do you have any closing thoughts or remarks, Bob?
Yeah, I'll kind of share 3 kind of closing remarks or 3 kind of components that I think are important for people to think about.
Yeah.
One is really your team, right? Making sure you have a really strong, dedicated team during implementation, but post-implementation. You really got to have that team that's making sure you have kind of the centralized governance over the system, because you have all these sites. You want to make sure that there's kind of everyone's not off doing their own thing, right? You want to make sure that someone's, what do you guys need? Okay, no problem. We can help you get there and kind of build the system, make sure you don't break it. The other piece I would say is kind of the whole engaging, right? Just that process we talk about. But again, engage, communicate, evangelize, right? Evangelize system. You got a lot of people thinking about it, and they're not thinking about what the other guy's doing. But I went around and shared the other plants, hey, here's how the other plants are doing. This is what they're doing, and this is how it all aligns. So you just had a vision of what's going on somewhere else. It's good to let people know. They're just kind of looking at what they do, just to share that we're all in this together. We're all using the system, and here's some reasons why it's important not to just kind of dismiss that. And the last thing I would say is, at the end, when you think about this whole ERP, is really thinking about process ownership versus system ownership.
Yeah.
And it's really important from an accountability standpoint, because here's what happens, right? They'll be the system owners, the IT people, or the business, implementation people. They kind of own the system, make sure the system's running, right? It's upgraded, you're going to do the updates, and that, infrastructurally wise, it's running. But you really need to make sure you have process ownership.
Yeah.
Because that's where they kind of, when things are going wrong transactionally, there really needs to be people that are responsible for that. And it's not, I'm the ERP guy, but it's not my responsibility to make sure your transactions are right. That's really up to you.
Yeah.
But it's really making sure you have those clear roles and saying, when we go live, we'll make sure this is running, but you're responsible for what's going on inside the system, and make sure they're kind of accountable. So it's definitely somewhere you got to spend some time, make sure you have that. Because it's continuous improvement, back to what I said about growth, right?
Yeah. Continuous
improvement. And everyone needs to be kind of working towards that, making sure it's not stagnant. ERP kind of it's always working for you.
Okay, amazing. And my personal takeaway from the conversation is going to be, you require a lot more preparation. You cannot simply treat this as the tactical initiative that, I'm simply going to buy a system, put a bunch of data, and it's going to work magically. ERP systems are not designed to work that way. So you better plan, or you are going to have extremely pretty picture, just the way Bob had for his company. On that note, Bob, I really want to thank you for your time. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Sam. I really appreciate the time that you gave me.
Okay, amazing. Thank you.
I cannot thank our guests enough for coming on the show, for sharing their knowledge and journey. I always pick up learnings from our guests, and hopefully you learned something new today. If you want to learn more about Bob, follow him on LinkedIn. Links and more information will also be available in the show notes. If anything in this podcast resonated with you and your business, you might want to check other related episodes, including the interview with Rich Said, who describes his journey and the pitfalls of implementing 6 ERP projects throughout his career. Also, the interview with Gabriel Ponescu, CEO of NowLogic, who discusses the nuances of the agriculture and poultry business and how the manufacturing processes are different from other industries. Also, don't forget to subscribe and spread the word among folks with similar backgrounds. If you have any questions or comments about the show, please review and rate us on your favorite podcasting platform, or DM me on any social channels. I'll try my best to respond personally and make sure you get help. Thank you, and I hope to catch you on the next episode of the WBS Podcast.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.